When an empire dies, it doesn't vanish overnight. It bleeds in silence, through empty factories, unpaid soldiers, and forgotten men waiting for a call that will never come. In 1991, the Soviet Union, a superpower built on fear and steel, collapsed not with a war, but with a whisper. And in that whisper, a man rose, silent, disciplined, invisible. A man who would one day rebuild the empire, not through ideology, but through control. His name was Vladimir Putin. The empire collapses, December 26, 1991. The red flag of the Soviet Union was lowered for the last time over the Kremlin. For 70 years, it had flown as the symbol of power, of the world's second superpower, rival to the United States. But now, that world was gone. 15 republics broke away, taking with them the land, the industries, and the people who had once called themselves Soviet. Russia, the largest of them, was left standing, but wounded. Its economy shattered, its military humiliated, and its people uncertain who they were anymore. Factories went silent. Salaries vanished. Veterans of Afghanistan, men who had fought under the Red Banner, returned to find their medals worthless in the new world. Moscow's skyline still gleamed, but its streets were cold, empty and restless. The once feared KGB, the sword and shield of the Soviet state, was dismantled. Overnight, thousands of its officers were left adrift. Men trained in secrets, loyalty and silence, now unemployed in a country that had lost its cause. One of them was a mid-level officer from Leningrad, recently renamed St. Petersburg, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. The lost operative Putin was 39 years old when the Soviet Union fell. He had spent years as a KGB officer stationed in Dresden, East Germany, a place where loyalty to Moscow was absolute. But when the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, Putin witnessed something that changed him forever. Crowds stormed the Stasi offices, breaking into the strongholds of power. He called Moscow for orders. None came. The great Soviet machine that he had served so faithfully had simply stopped answering. Later, he would say, "I called my superiors for instructions, but Moscow was silent." That silence, the silence of an empire's collapse, haunted him. When he returned to Russia, he found a country in ruins. The state that had raised him, trained him, and defined him no longer existed. But unlike many others, Putin didn't mourn for long. He adapted. He traded the KGB uniform for a civilian suit, entering the shadows of politics in St. Petersburg under a reformist mayor named Anatoly Sobchak. While others scrambled for money and power, Putin watched, learned, and waited. He was quiet, disciplined, unremarkable to most. But those who worked with him noticed something different. He never drank heavily. He never spoke too much. He never showed emotion. He simply worked. Russia. In chaos, meanwhile, Russia was falling apart. President Boris Yeltsin's government embraced capitalism overnight, a shock therapy that plunged millions into poverty. Oil prices crashed, inflation soared, and the ruble lost its value almost daily. Mafia groups filled the vacuum left by the state, running cities like private kingdoms. Corruption became currency. The once proud Red Army was reduced to chaos, unpaid, unprepared, and unwanted. Soldiers sold weapons to survive. Generals sold loyalty to the highest bidder. The dream of democracy was fading. The new Russia felt less like freedom and more like free fall. In the shadows of this chaos, men from the old system began to regroup. Businessmen, intelligence officers, and political survivors. They saw opportunity in disorder. And among them, Vladimir Putin was quietly moving upward. the quiet operator. Sobchak's city government gave Putin a title that meant little on paper: deputy mayor for external relations. His job was to attract investment from foreign companies and oversee trade. But in practice, it was something else: a bridge between politics, business, and the remnants of intelligence networks. He kept contacts from his KGB days. He spoke fluent German. He was efficient, reliable, incorruptible. Or at least, not obviously, corrupt. As Russia's chaos deepened, the qualities that made him invisible in Soviet times now made him valuable. He wasn't loud. He wasn't ideological. He didn't fight for attention. He simply got things done. Quietly. It was in this silence that his reputation began to spread. First in St. Petersburg, then in Moscow. People began to say, "Putin can be trusted. He's loyal. He doesn't betray." That word, loyalty, would become the cornerstone of his empire. The shadows of power. By 1996, Sobchak lost his position as mayor, accused of corruption. Many of his allies fled. But Putin did something unexpected. He stayed. He refused to betray his former boss. Even when investigators came for Sobchak, Putin helped him escape to France. That single act of loyalty caught the attention of powerful men in Moscow, men close to the president himself. In the corridors of the Kremlin, loyalty was rare and valuable. Within a year, Putin was offered a position in the presidential administration, a quiet, bureaucratic job, far from the spotlight. But those who knew him understood what that meant. He was back inside the system. And unlike before, he wasn't serving an ideology. He was serving power itself. A nation, waiting for control. By the late 1990s, Russia had become a fractured land. Chechnya had broken away in rebellion. The army was demoralized. The economy had collapsed again in the 1998 financial crisis. President Yeltsin was old, sick, and losing control of his government. The people were desperate for order, any kind of order. And somewhere in the Kremlin, the name Putin began appearing in closed meetings and private conversations. No one outside those rooms noticed. But inside, a plan was already forming. When nations fall, they don't stay fallen for long. Someone always rises from the ruins, not with the roar of revolution, but with the quiet patience of a man who knows that power, like fear, spreads silently. And as the last decade of the 20th century faded, the world had no idea that a new kind of empire was already taking shape. Not under a banner, but under a name. Putin, December 1994. The snow fell quietly over Grozny, blanketing a city that would soon be turned into ash. Moscow's tanks rolled forward, their metal tracks grinding the frozen streets of the rebellious Chechen capital. To the Russian generals, it was supposed to be a swift operation, a show of strength, a reminder that Moscow's authority was absolute. But history was about to carve something very different into the ruins of Grozny. Was Russia ready for the kind of war that wasn't fought on ideology, but on pride and vengeance? When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, it didn't just leave behind broken statues and torn flags. It left behind something far more dangerous: power without control. Across the Caucasus, ethnic republics declared independence. Chechnya, led by a former Soviet general named Djokhar Dudayev, refused to obey Moscow. The Kremlin, too weak to respond at first, watched with silent humiliation as a region within its borders declared itself a nation. How long could a wounded empire tolerate rebellion within its own skin? By 1994, the Russian Federation was still reeling from economic chaos, unpaid soldiers, and political infighting. President Boris Yeltsin, seen by many as erratic and desperate, needed a victory. Chechnya became his solution, his gamble. A small victorious war, his advisers called it. But wars born of desperation rarely go as planned. Could Yeltsin's attempt to restore control end up dismantling the very image of Russian power itself? When the first airstrikes began, Russia expected the Chechens to surrender within days. Instead, the opposite happened. The small republic, barely 1.2 million people, became a fortress. Guerrilla fighters poured into Grozny, armed not with tanks, but with conviction. They turned every building into a defensive line, every street into a trap. The Russian troops, untrained conscripts, many barely 20 years old, entered the city without maps, without coordination, and without understanding who they were truly fighting. How do you conquer a city when every shadow holds an enemy, and every window is a sniper's den? The battle for Grozny became one of the bloodiest urban conflicts since World War II. Russian armor was ambushed at every intersection. Entire columns of tanks burned for days, filling the streets with the stench of fuel and death. Soldiers called the city a meat grinder. Communication collapsed. Commanders argued over radios. Moscow insisted everything was under control. But the truth was far darker. What happens when the illusion of power finally meets the reality of chaos? By early January 1995, Russian forces had technically captured Grozny, but only in name. The city was rubble, its civilians dead or fleeing. Thousands of Russian soldiers were killed or missing. The Chechens simply melted into the mountains, regrouping for guerrilla attacks. Each victory Moscow declared became meaningless within days. The public back home watched the carnage unfold on live television. Mothers protested in the streets, demanding the return of their sons. Could the empire survive when its own citizens no longer believed in its cause? Inside the Kremlin, the war was tearing the government apart. Yeltsin's ministers turned on each other. Generals lied to cover up failures. Corruption devoured billions in military funds. The Chechens, outnumbered and outgunned, continued to strike Russian bases, derail trains, and ambush convoys. The Kremlin's confidence turned into paranoia. The enemy wasn't just in the mountains anymore. It was inside the system itself. How long before desperation begins to look for a savior? By 1996, the war had ground to a stalemate. Russia's economy was in freefall. Soldiers went unpaid for months. The public had turned against the government. Then came the attack that shattered the illusion completely. Chechen fighters stormed the southern city of Kislyar, taking hundreds of hostages. The operation humiliated Moscow, showing that even deep inside Russia, control was an illusion. If the army couldn't protect its own people, what purpose did it serve anymore? That same summer, Russian troops retreated from Chechnya, beaten not by a superior army, but by a smaller force with greater will. The peace treaty that followed was more like an admission of defeat. The once mighty Red Army, heir to the Soviet war machine, had been humiliated by a few thousand insurgents. Across Russia, the question lingered like smoke. Was this the final death of the Soviet dream, or the beginning of something darker? In the aftermath, Chechnya lay in ruins, but its spirit remained unbroken. Russia, however, was in chaos. Veterans returned home shattered, forgotten, and angry. The economy was collapsing, the government losing credibility by the day. In the shadows of this disillusionment, a quiet, calculating man began to rise. A man who watched the war not from the battlefield, but from the corridors of Moscow's power. Was he the answer to Russia's humiliation, or the next storm waiting to erupt? The First Chechen War ended in defeat, but for one man, it was the perfect opening. a chance to rebuild Russia's pride, to restore order through fear, and to reshape the nation in his own image. His name would soon echo through every corner of the world. Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. But how does a silent bureaucrat turn into the ruler of a wounded empire? That answer begins here. The year was 1996. Russia stood at a crossroads, not between democracy and tyranny, but between survival and disintegration. The First Chechen War had ended in shame. Thousands of soldiers dead, billions wasted, and a nation's pride shattered. The Soviet giant was gone, replaced by a fragile state gasping for air. The ruble collapsed, wages went unpaid, and hunger crept into homes once shielded by the promise of socialism. But in the ruins of defeat, something else began to stir. A quiet hunger for order. Who would restore it? And at what cost? Boris Yeltsin's presidency was unraveling. The man who once stood atop tanks to defend democracy now stumbled under the weight of corruption and illness. His approval ratings had plummeted into single digits. Oligarchs, the new kings of Russia's capitalist experiment, carved the country into private empires, each richer and more powerful than the government itself. In the corridors of the Kremlin, loyalty had become a commodity. What happens to a nation when power no longer serves purpose, only survival? Meanwhile, in the shadows of St. Petersburg's local government, a quiet figure worked unnoticed. His name was Vladimir Putin, a former KGB officer who had spent years studying the anatomy of power, how it was gained, how it was lost, and how it could be reclaimed without anyone realizing, until it was too late. To his superiors, he was disciplined, loyal, unambitious. To those who watched more closely, he was something else. Patient. How dangerous is a man who waits rather than demands? Putin had spent years observing the chaos that consumed post-Soviet Russia. He watched how democratic reform turned into political anarchy. He saw the oligarchs use television to shape reality itself, and he understood something most in the Kremlin didn't: that the people didn't crave freedom. They craved stability. They would trade liberty for certainty and hope for control. Could the man who understood this trade become the one to offer it, on his own terms? In 1998, Yeltsin's government collapsed under yet another economic crisis. Ministers resigned in droves, inflation soared, and the ruble plummeted overnight. Amid the chaos, Yeltsin turned to the same institution he had once tried to weaken: the intelligence services. He needed someone who could bring discipline, silence, and fear back into the system. And that's when Vladimir Putin appeared from the shadows, called to Moscow like a ghost from a forgotten order. Appointed as the head of the FSB, the modern successor to the KGB, Putin found himself in control of the very nerves of the state: surveillance, secrets, and silence. Within months, he began purging the agency of corrupt officials, reinstating loyalty through quiet intimidation. He said little, appeared rarely, and acted with precision. Who was this man? The bureaucrat with the face of a civil servant and the instincts of a spy. By 1999, Russia was barely holding together. The economy had imploded, separatism spread like wildfire, and Yeltsin's health was visibly failing. The president needed a successor, someone loyal, controllable, and obedient. The oligarchs wanted a caretaker who would preserve their power. They didn't know that the man they were about to elevate had no intention of serving anyone but himself. Putin became prime minister in August 1999, a quiet appointment that most Russians ignored at first. Few had heard of him. His approval rating barely reached 2%. The media called him a placeholder, a temporary solution to an unsolvable problem. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. In September, a wave of mysterious apartment bombing struck Moscow and other cities, killing hundreds of civilians. The explosions shocked the nation. Panic spread overnight. The government immediately blamed Chechen terrorists, reigniting the call for revenge. Putin, still barely known, appeared on television with cold determination in his eyes and uttered the now famous promise: "We will find them anywhere, even in the toilet, and we will wipe them out." The phrase horrified some, but electrified many. For the first time in years, Russians saw a leader who didn't tremble, who spoke with certainty, even if his certainty carried the scent of blood. Was it justice, or was it theater? Putin's decisive tone contrasted sharply with Yeltsin's weakness. The public, exhausted from humiliation and chaos, latched onto him like a drowning man clutching driftwood. Almost overnight, his approval ratings soared. The oligarchs smiled. They believed they had found their obedient successor. They didn't yet realize they had awakened something they could never control again. Then came the next spark: the Second Chechen War. In October 1999, Russian jets roared once more over the Caucasus. Putin declared that the time for negotiation was over. Grozny would burn again, and this time there would be no retreat. His orders were ruthless, efficient, and absolute. Was this revenge for Russia's humiliation, or the birth of a new kind of power? The war became his proving ground. Russian media, now heavily influenced by state pressure, painted him as the savior of the nation. Every image, every headline, every speech built a singular narrative. Putin was restoring order. The same military that had once fled Grozny now marched back under his command, ruthless and silent. And for the first time in a decade, Russians began to feel something they hadn't felt since the Soviet collapse: pride. Could a nation born from defeat truly rise again through fear? As the war raged, Yeltsin's condition worsened. He was a relic of a past that had lost its grip on the present. On December 31st, 1999, in a broadcast watched by millions, Boris Yeltsin resigned unexpectedly, naming Vladimir Putin as acting president of Russia. His voice trembled. Putin's did not. In that moment, a quiet former spy became the ruler of a nuclear empire. But his rise was not a miracle. It was a strategy decades in the making. Putin understood the language of power: control the narrative, eliminate unpredictability, and reward obedience. He moved quickly, consolidating the media, replacing governors, silencing critics, and restoring the authority of the state. Was it leadership? Or was it occupation of his own country's freedom? For many Russians, none of that mattered. The ruble stabilized. Salaries returned. Streets grew quiet again. Stability, the very thing people had traded liberty for, had finally arrived. They didn't question how it came. They didn't want to. After years of chaos, silence was comfort. Fear was normal. And Putin was order. But could peace built on fear ever be real peace at all? By the year 2000, Russia had entered a new era. The oligarchs who once laughed behind closed doors began to vanish. Some fled, some were arrested, others simply disappeared. The media fell silent, and the people stopped asking questions. The state had learned how to breathe again, but through one pair of lungs only. How long could one man hold the weight of an empire before it began to crush him too? Behind his composure, Putin carried something darker. a conviction that Russia's humiliation could never be repeated, that weakness invited enemies, and mercy was a luxury the nation could no longer afford. He began rebuilding not just an army, but an ideology, one rooted in strength, control, and destiny. Was it nationalism, or something far older, something imperial, reborn in modern form? And so, in just a few short years, a nameless bureaucrat had risen from obscurity to command one of the most powerful nations on earth. Not through revolution, not through democracy, but through chaos, and the promise to end it. But every promise carries a price. As the Chechen mountains burned once again under Russian fire, the world began to notice the new face of Moscow, a face calm, disciplined, and utterly unreadable. The West applauded him at first, believing he would modernize Russia, integrate it into the global order. But they did not understand the man behind the handshake. Putin was not rebuilding the Soviet Union. He was building something colder, a Russia that would never bow again. And in the shadows of Grozny, beneath the smoke of another victory, a new question began to echo through the Kremlin's marble halls. When a nation defines its strength through fear, how long before it must create new enemies to stay strong? The bombs began to fall before dawn. In the mountain passes of Chechnya, the silence of winter was broken by the thunder of Russian artillery. Villages disappeared in flashes of light. Bridges collapsed, roads burned, and the land itself seemed to vanish beneath the weight of steel and fire. It was the year 1999, and the Russian bear had returned, not wounded, not hesitant, but enraged. But was this truly a war for justice, or the perfect storm to crown a new ruler? The Second Chechen War wasn't announced with speeches or ceremony. It came suddenly, cloaked in vengeance. The Kremlin declared that terrorists from Chechnya had attacked Russia's heart. And now, Russia would strike back with everything it had left. There would be no negotiations, no ceasefires, no second humiliation. The words were familiar, but the man behind them was not. Vladimir Putin, the newly appointed Prime Minister, spoke with the cold certainty of someone who had already made peace with the cost of victory. Could this war be less about the Caucasus and more about Moscow itself? The campaign began with airstrikes, relentless, mechanical, precise. Russian jets carpet-bombed Grozny, the Chechen capital, reducing it to dust. Entire districts vanished beneath rubble. Columns of refugees fled through frozen roads as bombs followed them into the valleys. Reporters on the ground described it as one of the most brutal bombardments since World War II. But inside Russia, few saw that horror. The images were filtered, the footage controlled, the message crafted. How powerful does truth remain when the lens itself belongs to the state? Television became Putin's first battlefield, and his first victory. The chaos of the 1990s had left Russians desperate for reassurance, and the nightly news became the stage on which a new myth was born, the story of a man who would restore order, no matter the cost. Putin is strength. Putin is order. That became the unspoken message broadcast across millions of screens. Every explosion in Grozny became a symbol of rebirth. Every Russian soldier on camera was framed as a hero, reclaiming the nation's dignity. But behind that illusion, how many screams were swallowed by silence? By early 2000, the Russian army had surrounded Grozny. The city was a wasteland of shattered concrete and unburied dead. Journalists described scenes where entire neighborhoods were erased in minutes, where survivors dug through the ruins searching for children. Yet Moscow declared victory after victory, parading it as proof of Russia's resurrection. And the people believed. They wanted to. After years of chaos, they needed to. Is belief the final weapon of every empire, or its first casualty? For Putin, this was no longer just a war. It was a stage of transformation. Every speech, every decision, every photograph of him visiting soldiers at the front was calculated to craft an image. A leader, untouched by doubt, forged in fire. He appeared in crisp uniforms, eyes cold, words measured. He didn't shout. He didn't promise. He simply acted. And in that stillness, Russians saw the opposite of Yeltsin. Not a drunkard, not a reformer, but a ruler. How quickly can power change hands when fatigue turns into faith? By February 2000, Grozny fell. The Russian flag rose once again over its ruins. The city was destroyed, but to the Kremlin, it was proof that Russia was strong again. Western journalists called it a massacre. Russian media called it redemption. The truth was buried under the debris of both narratives. But as smoke rose from Grozny, so too did Putin's approval ratings, higher than any Russian leader since the fall of the USSR. And then, on March 26, 2000, he became president of Russia. No revolution, no gunfire, no protest, just the quiet inevitability of a nation exhausted into obedience. A war had built him. Propaganda had sculpted him. Fear had sustained him. But could he now survive the peace that followed? Putin's first moves as president were swift and surgical. He consolidated the intelligence services, placed loyal men in key military and administrative posts, and brought independent television networks under state control. The oligarchs who had made him president began to realize their mistake. Some, like Boris Berezovsky, fled abroad. Others, like Mikhail Khodorkovsky, were arrested, their wealth dismantled, their influence erased. The age of shared power was over. There would be only one center now, the Kremlin, and the man who commanded it. But what kind of leader emerges when no one is left to say no? Meanwhile, Chechnya descended into occupation. The republic was pacified under brutal force, with puppet leaders installed and resistance driven underground. Entire villages vanished without record. Rebel leaders were hunted and executed. But for Putin, it wasn't merely about control. It was about rebuilding the psychology of empire. To rule Russia, he knew, you must rule through fear. Yet fear has a habit of consuming even those who wield it. How long could this fragile order endure before the ghosts it buried began to rise again? He used every weapon available: propaganda, politics, and the illusion of stability. Schools began to teach about patriotism and national pride. Soldiers who fought in Chechnya were honored as heroes. The war was rewritten not as a tragedy, but as a triumph. And for many Russians, it worked. Their salaries were paid again, crime fell, the streets felt safe. Was this peace? Or just quiet under control? Internationally, Putin presented himself as a pragmatic modernizer. He charmed Western leaders, spoke of cooperation, democracy, and stability. But beneath the surface, the machinery of authoritarianism was already in motion. The free press was silenced. Dissent was reclassified as treason. Elections became performances with predetermined endings. And the war that made him, the fire of Grozny, became the unspoken foundation of a new Russia. Can a nation ever rebuild itself on ashes without breathing in the smoke? By 2003, the world had moved on. The Second Chechen War faded from global headlines, overshadowed by America's invasion of Iraq. Yet for Russia, the war had never truly ended. It had merely shifted from battlefields to institutions, from villages to television screens. Putin had won more than a military victory. He had won control over truth itself. And once truth belongs to one man, what remains of freedom? Inside the Kremlin, Putin's transformation was complete. The former spy had become the embodiment of the state. His power no longer relied on popularity, but on inevitability. Like the czars before him, he became both ruler and symbol, a man whose existence justified the order he imposed. But symbols have one weakness: they must remain unbroken. What happens when fear begins to fade, or when enemies no longer exist to justify it? The war had given Putin his myth, the savior who restored Russia's pride. But myths require maintenance. They must be fed with new victories, new enemies, new crises. And somewhere deep within the Kremlin, the realization dawned: peace could never serve him the way war did. Would the man forged by conflict ever allow the fires to die out? Chechnya lay in ruins, its people scattered, its resistance crushed. Russia had reclaimed its sense of destiny, but at a cost history rarely forgets. The seeds of control planted in the rubble of Grozny would grow into something far larger, reaching across borders and decades. The war that began in the Caucasus would echo in Georgia, in Crimea, in Ukraine, each conflict a shadow of the same design. Stability through domination, power through fear, unity through silence. In the end, the Second Chechen War was not just a conflict. It was a crucible, one that forged both a leader and a nation in the same flame. The question that remained was no longer who Putin was, but what Russia was becoming under him. And as the fires of Chechnya dimmed, a darker realization began to take shape. When a leader builds his strength from war, can peace ever be anything but the beginning of his next battle? The smoke of Grozny had barely cleared when Moscow began to rewrite the story. On the ruins of a city once filled with defiance, flags fluttered, cameras rolled, and the narrative was sealed. Russia had risen again. The war was declared over. Order had been restored. But beneath that order, the ground still burned. Was it peace, or merely the silence that follows exhaustion? Vladimir Putin entered the Kremlin not as a reformer, but as a reflection of what Russia had become: wounded, proud, and unwilling to kneel again. His path to power had not been through democracy, but through fire. Every bomb dropped on Chechnya echoed like a heartbeat in his new rule. He had learned the lesson of empire the hard way. Control must never again be surrendered. Not to chaos, not to freedom, not even to truth. Could a leader forged in war ever learn to rule without one? The early years of his presidency were years of reconstruction, not just of cities, but of psychology. The people were tired. They had endured a decade of collapse, crime, and hunger. Putin promised normalcy, discipline, pride. And he delivered it, in the way only an intelligence officer could. Television spoke with one voice. Critics vanished. Newspapers were bought or banned. The oligarchs who had once ruled the airwaves were exiled or imprisoned. Elections were conducted, but outcomes were never uncertain. Stability returned, but it carried the scent of surveillance. In exchange for silence, Russians were given predictability. In exchange for obedience, they received the illusion of peace. Was it a fair trade, or the most dangerous bargain of all? Chechnya, meanwhile, was transformed from a battlefield into a fiefdom. The Kremlin installed Ramzan Kadyrov, a loyal strongman who ruled with an iron fist and declared absolute loyalty to Putin. Together they rebuilt Grozny into a glittering city of mosques and skyscrapers, a monument to submission. The scars of war were covered with marble and glass, but beneath the surface lay the same old fear. Only now, it served a different master. Can a city rebuilt on obedience ever truly forget the screams that built it? For the rest of Russia, the Chechen War became memory. Not a wound, but a myth. It was taught as the moment the country stood tall again, when strength triumphed over chaos. But myths, once accepted, shape destiny. The war didn't end in Chechnya. It ended in the minds of millions who came to believe that strength was salvation and dissent was betrayal. Was this national healing or collective hypnosis? The world, at first, applauded. Western leaders saw in Putin a partner, pragmatic, composed, rational. They believed he was stabilizing a broken country, steering it toward democracy. But they misunderstood the nature of the man they were dealing with. Putin had studied them just as he had studied his enemies, patient, calculating, waiting for weakness to reveal itself. And when it did, he would not hesitate. The lesson of Chechnya was simple. The world respects strength, and strength is built through control. Every war thereafter, whether political, economic, or military, would follow the same blueprint. The state would create order through pressure, loyalty through fear, unity through silence. Could a nation's soul survive when its survival depended on submission? By 2005, Russia had transformed. The chaos of the Yeltsin era was gone, replaced by a strange, disciplined quiet. The economy recovered, fueled by oil and gas. Streets were clean, salaries rose, national pride returned. But the air felt heavier. Conversations grew cautious. People stopped speaking of politics in public. The invisible hand of the state was everywhere, in schools, in screens, in thought. Peace had returned, yes. But it was a peace that demanded stillness. And stillness in time becomes suffocation. For Putin, however, this was the Russia he had envisioned, unified, powerful, and unquestioning. He had succeeded where others failed. Yet power built on control can never rest. It must constantly reaffirm itself. To stay in power, he needed new victories, new enemies. And the ghosts of Chechnya gave him both. Terrorist attacks, some real, others suspected, rekindled fear across Russia. Each one justified new laws, new surveillance, new military actions. The line between external threat and internal dissent blurred. Anyone who questioned the Kremlin's narrative risked being labeled an enemy of the state. Fear had become governance. But when a ruler governs through fear, does he rule his people or his own reflection in their silence? Chechnya became the template for future wars, not in geography, but in philosophy. When conflicts erupted in Georgia, 2008, Crimea, 2014, and Ukraine, 2022, the strategy was the same. Overwhelm with force, control the story, define reality before anyone else could. Each war was justified as protection, each invasion framed as restoration. And in every broadcast, every speech, every soldier's march, the same echo returned. The lesson of Grozny. How many empires have perished believing that their greatest victory could be repeated forever? The West watched with confusion, then alarm. Sanctions came and went. Diplomacy rose and fell. But Putin understood something they did not. He wasn't merely rebuilding territory. He was rebuilding identity. Russia would no longer measure its greatness in wealth or freedom, but in endurance, the ability to suffer and survive, no matter the cost. Is that resilience or tragedy disguised as pride? 2 decades after the Chechen War, Putin's Russia had become what the Soviet Union once claimed to be, a fortress surrounded by enemies, ruled by certainty, held together by memory and myth. Children grew up hearing that chaos was the true enemy, that freedom was dangerous, and that obedience was patriotic. A generation born after Grozny would never know that their peace was built on ashes. Would they ever question it? Or had history been rewritten too perfectly? Inside the Kremlin, Putin's transformation was complete. He was no longer the quiet bureaucrat from St. Petersburg, nor the nervous prime minister of 1999. He was the state itself, its voice, its armor, its myth. Every photograph, every gesture, every silence was deliberate. Even his stillness became power. But power that must be maintained through fear eventually fears itself. How long can a ruler control destiny before destiny begins to control him? The war that began in Chechnya ended far beyond its borders. It shaped modern Russia, its politics, its wars, its view of the world. But it also shaped Putin. The man who promised order delivered it through dominance. The man who ended chaos replaced it with control. And the man who rose from the ruins of a broken empire became the architect of a new one, colder, quieter, and perhaps more fragile than it appears. Empires, after all, do not fall in battle. They fall in silence, when the people no longer believe, when fear becomes habit, and when rulers mistake obedience for loyalty. Could this too be Russia's fate, waiting quietly beneath the calm surface of power? As the lights of Moscow glitter across the frozen river, one truth remains unspoken. The Chechen War may have ended on paper, but its shadow never lifted. It lingers in every broadcast, every soldier's salute, every law written in the name of order. It is the ghost that whispers behind the Kremlin walls, a reminder that the war that built a ruler may one day demand its due. Because wars never truly end, they simply change their names.